Are you guys ready? We are going to read chapter 14, The Jolly Sailor. I'm not even going to talk to you because we need to read. This is going to get good. The darkness in the tunnel seemed dense as stone. Kipper's small lantern light bobbed about with hardly more effect than if he'd been holding a firefly on a chain. They could barely see the pools of murky water that lay along the path under the still, deadly gray vapors, the evil breath of the sleeping serpent. 2 rats scurried by, sending a cold rush of air up their legs. Emily stifled a shriek, and the lantern in Kipper's hands shook violently, but nobody suggested going back. They simply went on and on, with blackness closing in behind them and blackness barely opening ahead. There was no way of telling how far they'd come, how far they might have to go, twisting and turning. There was no way to measure time or distance, but just as Emily began to wonder if they might not wander down the tunnel forever, Kipper clutched her arm. "Look, Emily." They finally arrived at the flight of steps that was a twin to the one which they had just climbed down in the tunnel. "Are we going up them?" Emily whispered. "Looks like we ain't got any place to go but up or back," Kipper replied. "See, Emily? Beyond them steps is a rock wall, same as the other. Up here's the tunnel runs from where we come to where we got to go, and no more." They stood still a moment, looking up and listening. There was only silence from above. The Kipper mentioned to Emily and began to climb the steep stairs. When he reached the trapdoor overhead, he drew a deep breath and pushed the door up a crack. Then he gave a low whistle. "Whee-oo!" "What is it, Kipper?" Emily asked. "Dingus, Emily!" Kipper turned to her with the oddest expression on his face. "I think what we just arrived at is the cellar of the tavern near Pa's fish shop." Emily didn't know whether she wanted to laugh or cry over this discovery. All that treacherous journey only to end up in a place near Kipper's home, and the comical look on Kipper's face. Kipper peered through the trapdoor. "Now I'm certain as I can be we've come to the cellar of Jolly Sailor, which I run errands for and the like. This is where the wine and spirits get kept. Why, dead ahead, that's the big old keg that's been warmed by my bottom more times than a fish flaps his fins, as Pa always says. Come along, Emily, let's go on up." They scrambled quickly through the open trapdoor, and Emily was able to study the room they entered. 2 whale oil lamps on the walls dimly lit up the row upon row of bottles. Staring across the room at one another with vacant cork eyes, huge blackened keg studded the floor with no semblance of order at all, as if they were abandoned toys of giant childs grown tired with his game. It was like nothing Emily had ever seen before, until her eyes fell on something totally familiar, something she had climbed over time and time again in her own family attic. "Kipper, my 2 trunks over there in the corner. What are they doing here?" She threaded her way around the giant kegs to where the trunks lay. Kipper ran to her side. The locks had been pried off both trunks, so it was an easy matter to lift the lids and look in. "Empty," said Kipper with disgust. "Beats me what the scurvy lot that frequents this establishment wants with silk dresses and lace petticoats no bigger than would fit a tadpole. And ain't anybody gonna get such payment for old clothes no matter how fancy they once was." "But Kipper," Emily said, "it wasn't just my clothes in the trunks. All of Mama's jewels were in the trunks too. Everything." Kipper's jaw fell open. "Whew," he whistled. "Well, ain't no explaining how the trunks got here, but ain't no question why. I wonder about—" He was interrupted by a sudden, wild explosion of laughter bursting down the cellar passageway. "Another whoop-de-doo going on in the private room," said Kipper darkly. "I ain't ever been loud in there. But from the looks of it, the crew, that is, the Captain Smurlock being one, I ain't missing much, you know. Emily, once I—" Kipper was interrupted again by another burst of ugly laughter, only this time caused him and Emily to turn to one another with looks of dismay and horror. From somewhere in that laughter, they heard the unmistakable, blood-chilling, all too familiar sound of a hiss. "I aim to go see what's up," Kipper whispered. "There ain't much light in the passageway and plenty of kegs to hide behind." Without even waiting Emily's opinion of this plan, Kipper darted for the door. A moment later, he had disappeared. Emily had no intention of waiting alone. She raced after him, following as he slipped like an eel from keg to keg toward a sharp shaft of light that stabbed through a partially open door. Crouching behind a large keg, they peered into the room. Around a long, scarred oak table, laden with a ham, a roast beef, a turkey, and all sorts of pudding, cakes, and custards. A collection, in fact, of the delectable foods Emily was used to seeing in the locked icebox, sat the grisly Captain Scurlock, his crew of rough officers, and 2 other persons. One of these, as they had guessed it would be, was Mrs. Meaching. With one hand under her sharp chin, the fingers of another coiled along a long pipe whose smoke gilded silkily up her thin nose, she lounged in a carved black chair at the foot of the table. But, unlike the first day she had entered Sugar Hill Hall, it was not Mrs. Meaching that caused Emily's blood to turn to ice in her veins. This time, it was a second person. A person who sat in a chair raised from all the others, as if in a platform, at the head of the table. The face of the person was one Emily had loved. You guys have any guesses on who it is? No, not the face of Uncle Twice, but the face of a woman. Vanished, however, was the sweet expression, the soft eyes, the gentle mouth. The face was now curiously twisted, hard mask. The eyes glittered like blue glass marbles, and the mouth, no more than a black hole lined with red, opened wide to pour out a ugly howl of laughter. Emily turned to Kipper with horror. Auntie Plum. Looked up there in the remembrance room, remembering her bad deeds. Oh, it does my tender heart good, shrieked Mrs. Plumley. And when I think of her sitting there prim as you please, drinking her Auntie Plum's nice, sweet, warm tea, she exploded again with coarse laughter, never suspecting what was in it, and pouring out all her tender little secrets about Mama's thimble and Papa's cap, getting tipsier and tipsier, and spelling out all the nasty little tricks regarding the fish syrup, the old buzzards in the attic, that filthy cat, and her 19 gold coins. "Sewn up in my mattress, Auntie Plum," she whispered to me, pleased as pleased can be. So Mrs. Plumley was the evil behind the evil, the eyes and ears of Sugar Hill Hall, which had been told nothing but seen and heard everything, and now it was known how. As Miss Plumley spoke, her face grew uglier and uglier until she was spitting out the words, "Meal-mouthed, meddling little brat. I'd like to have my hands on those precious clothes of hers so I could have the pleasure of hurling them into this fireplace all over again. Well, she'll come out of the remembrance room a different child than she went in. Mark my words. And if she gets any more dangerous ideas, there's always another cup of tea in Auntie Plum's room. Eh, Meaching?" "Indeed, Plumley," said Mrs. Meaching in a fawning voice. Then a poisonous smile spread over Mrs. Plumley's face. "I must say I've never done a finer acting job. But then I didn't earn my title, Queen of the Dance Halls, for nothing, eh?" "That was a splendid drop you did in the parlor, Plumley." "Simply splendid," hissed Mrs. Meaching. "Ah, yes," mused Mrs. Plumley. She went into a trance, but collected herself quickly. "Well, perhaps on that note, we better take leave and be on our way." The 2 ladies rose. The officers stumbled to their feet, and Emily felt a sharp tug of her arm. "Ain't no time to lose. Let's get back to the tunnel." Numb with horror and shock, Emily could barely make one leg follow the other as they slipped silently down the passageway with Kipper. It was not until they were back in the tunnel with the trapdoor safely overhead that her throat unlocked enough for her to speak. "Oh, Kipper, how could I have been so stupid to believe them?" "Now see here, Emily," said Kipper sternly as they began their journey back up the tunnel. "Would anyone have believed her? She's a professional actress. And how was you supposed to know that guzzling tea wasn't just tea? There ain't no use banging your head against the wall to punish yourself for what ain't your fault. Anyway, we learned a couple of somethings out of this visit. Pairs as how Miss Plumley is a chief viper round Sugar Hill Hall, and not the snake lady. And also pairs as how she ain't the one ain't Twice as protecting. Which means that it might be Uncle Twice after all." Emily's voice broke. "Maybe," said Kipper. More maybe. Most likely. How does Aunt Toyce know he's really alive? Emily cried. Suppose he isn't, and they've just been lying to her all along. There you go with more supposings, Emily, said Kipper. Yes, but if he's alive, then where is he? Emily was close to tears. That's what we got to find out, said Kipper. But right now we best hurry back to the remembrance room. And me out of it, in case them two ladies decides to pay you a visit. You know, you could have knocked me over when I see them at the Jolly Sailor. I never seen them going in or out either. Beats me how they sneak in and out so secret, of course. Kipper was interrupted by a distant sound, clap of the trapdoor behind them being slammed shut. Footsteps followed sharply up the stone stairs, and a moment later, the screeching, hissing voices of Miss Meaching and Miss Plumley echoed hollowly down the tunnel. What the? Exclaimed Kipper softly. Them loony vipers is using the tunnel. Come on. He grabbed Emily's hand and nearly pulled her off her feet. We better move faster than we ever have done in our lives. If the trip down the tunnel had been terrifying, not knowing what was before them, the trip up the tunnel was 10 minutes or so, knowing what was behind them. Stumbling on the rocky path, grasping for breath in the stagnant air, they ran. Both the twists and turns of the tunnel protected them, and the sound of echoing voices of Mrs. Meaching and Miss Plumley drowned out the sound of their footsteps. When they reached the stairway to the remembrance room, they scrambled up the stone steps and hurried themselves into the room. Then they swiftly but carefully lowered the trapdoor and flattened themselves on top of it, like two panting, trembling small animals who had just escaped their hunters listening. The voices came nearer and nearer. They paused at the foot of the stairs to snarl and hiss for a few moments, and then the voices moved on in the direction of the stone wall and disappeared. Kipper stared round-eyed at Emily. Them two ain't elves which can vanish. Must be steps we missed. Steps? Said Emily. To where? Kipper shrugged. Beats me. Then Emily gasped. Do you suppose they lead into the ballroom? It would be just about overhead, Kipper. Dingus, Emily, you could be right, exclaimed Kipper. Of course, it's more rightly ballroom, which was, 'cause ain't likely any balls being held there now. What with no windows, no doors, and what we know of. More of like a tomb, if you ask me. Kipper had no sooner said the words than his face froze. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, Emily. It's all right, Emily said quickly. I've already thought of it. Uncle Twice might be in that room, buried alive. Or dead. Wasn't that a possibility too? But nobody said it. The words weren't necessary. The thoughts filled the small room like crushing stone. We'll finish this soon. Bye, guys.